Okay, next we're going to move on to item 4, the Transportation Impact Analysis Guideline Review.
Thank you, Chair Gokin. One moment here while I pull up the slides. All right, so thank you, Chair Gokin, members of the Commission. I'm Nathan Schmidt, Transportation Planning and Mobility Manager, and this item before you is the Transportation Impact Analysis Guidelines Review. So the recommended action for this item is to simply obtain feedback on updates to the Transportation Impact Analysis Guidelines from the Commission. So just to go in first, I just want to cover, for this presentation, I'm going to go over the purpose of the guidelines and then go to a bit of a review of the background of how the guidelines were developed, and then we'll take a look at the guidelines, each of the various elements of the guidelines, because this will be the first time the Traffic and Mobility Commission has reviewed those. So first off, the TIA guidelines purpose is to forecast, describe, and analyze the effects of development will have on the existing and future circulation infrastructure, and that includes for all modes of the network. So it includes vehicles, pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit access. Another main purpose is to assist city staff and the public when making land use decisions and other development decisions. And the findings of the TIAs are then used to determine the project-specific improvements or the required mitigation measures. So for the background, over the past 13 years or so, the field of transportation engineering has really gone through lots of changes, significant changes in response to a variety of new laws, plans, and policies. In particular, the state of California has been at the forefront of many of these. This slide presents an overview of these laws and policies which have resulted in the current TIA guidelines that are before you now, which were developed in 2018. The first of those really began in 2008 with AB 1358, which is the California Complete Streets Act. This act requires that all circulation elements and general plans include a complete streets approach that balances the needs of all users of the street. Then in 2013, the state enacted the Senate Bill 743, SB 743, which creates a process to change the way that transportation impacts are analyzed under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. Really the main intent from that was to shift from using the traditional level of service metrics to a vehicle miles traveled analysis. Just to note that Carlsbad did adopt our current VMT guidelines on June 16th, 2020. And then the other main elements really behind the current traffic impact analysis guidelines, which was developed in 2015, is the city's general plan and growth management plans. So in 2015, in accordance with these new laws described above, the GMP and the Climate Action Plan were developed, and then multimodal level of service was a key policy and element that came out of this update. So together with all of these actions and the new laws, that has resulted in the TIA guidelines that are before you today. So now I'm going to go over the process and all the nuts and bolts that are within the guidelines in itself. First, I'll take a look at the scope and requirements. We'll look at the scenarios to be studied, traffic generation, trip distribution and assignment, then looking at the project impact evaluation process, and finally the significance of impacts to all modes. So first off, the question is, when is a TIA needed? So this table here is directly from the guidelines itself. The type of TIA required for a project, it's based upon consistency with the general plan or specific plan, as well as the number of vehicle trips that are generated by the project site in terms of either ADT, which is the average daily traffic, or the peak hour trips. So just as a quick example, a project coming in to be reviewed, say it has an ADT of 655, 85 peak hour trips. We would determine that, and it doesn't conform to an existing specific plan or master plan. It would then require what we call a level 4 type TIA analysis. So we use that top table, and then we go down to the bottom, And level 4 here, each of the dots, that then indicates the required elements that would be required for level 4 TIA analysis. So that's when a project is needed. Now for the TIA scoping requirements. So this is the process where a developer or a project applicant submits a scope to city staff for review. Within that scope, it includes the basic input parameters that are required for the report, such as trip generation distribution, the forecast methodology that is used, the specific study intersections, the location of those, the segments, any jurisdictional impacts. So do we have overlapping issues with cities in our boundaries, San Marcos, Encinitas, and then a site plan for the project site. So staff can see how project would operate within the site and how it would connect to our own roadway network. So as part of the scoping analysis, the project is required to define the study area. So that's done differently for each of the various modes. So first, for vehicle analysis, the project is required to look at the access points to the site, also provide an evaluation of how on-site circulation will function. For determining the intersections, first, all study intersections would be within a quarter mile from the sites. This is signalized intersections, and those within quarter mile to a half a mile could be added to the TIA at the discretion of the city engineer. The study segments, those would include segments which received 50 or more peak hour trips in either direction of travel. So it's not a summation of the two directions, it's actually just in one direction. If either direction receives 50 or more peak hour trips, then it would be included in the project study area. For pedestrian and bicycle analysis, this would include facilities that are directly connected to the project access points, and that would extend out to the nearest intersection or connections to a multi-use trail. And finally, for transit analysis, that would include the area, essentially all existing transit lines and transit stops that are located within a 1/2 mile walking distance of the project site would be included in the study area. Then scenarios to be studied. And again, these vary by the specific project size in terms of how much traffic it develops. This is the full list of studies here. So those include the existing conditions, so conditions as they are today for the project. Then it goes to existing plus. So this would be then adding on the existing project trip generation and project assignment on top of the existing traffic volumes. And that's how you get the existing plus project scenario. Cumulative, that includes, think of all projects kind of in the near term. So that would include all city approved projects and city pending projects that the city is aware of. You would do a separate trip generation and assignment for those projects, and then add those onto the existing traffic volumes to get your cumulative. Then from that, you do the same, you add cumulative plus your project traffic volumes. And then the final scenario is the horizon year. So these traffic volumes are typically derived from the Sandag model. Typically that's a period of 20 years out in the future, trying to capture what the traffic volumes would be like 20 years out. And then finally adding on the project volumes, horizon year plus project would be the last scenario. Next steps in terms of project trip generation and distribution. The guidelines state that the Sandag trip generators and not so brief guide, these are two locally available trip generation sources that the city uses to determine project trip generation. In addition, if the land use are not indicated in either of these sources, the project may also use ITE's trip generation manual, which is the nationally recognized source of trip generation information. Just a quick note on trip generation, there are some reductions that are allowed by the current guidelines. These would be reductions in trip generation for things like mixed use developments, transit orientated developments, which are projects located within a quarter mile of a transit station. So that's trip generation, distribution. So that is essentially taking all the trips generated by the project site and assigning them out onto the city's network. So that data is based largely either upon a manual assignment, which is based upon existing traffic data. The project applicant would propose a trip distribution to city staff. We would review that with them. And once we're in agreement, we would say this works and that's what you can use for your distribution. The sand egg model can also be used to provide trip generation estimates, typically used for larger projects where trip generations are having to go out further because of the significant trip generation numbers. So that's trip generation. Next is the analysis methodologies. So the TIA guidelines, they provide specific methodology for the analysis of freeways, roadway segments, intersections, and freeway ramps. I'm going to cover more of the local type analysis for segments and intersections. Freeway and the ramps, those are more under jurisdiction of Caltrans. So I'll leave the guidelines to speak to those. So first, in regards to signalized intersections, the city currently looks at queue and storage analysis. So this involves looking at the left turn volumes, comparing that with the length of the turn pockets. The city uses a standard kind of engineering rule of thumb of 1 foot per left turning vehicle to determine the queue length there. If the left turn volumes exceed 250 per hour, that means a second left turn lane would then be needed. Then looking at the right turn volumes, the rule is a dedicated right turn is needed when right turn volumes exceed 150 vehicles per hour. For unsignalized intersections, the analysis methodology is a traffic signal warrant. So taking a look at the volumes, other engineering considerations, and seeing if a signal is warranted. For roundabouts, intersection level of service is used. So that reports out traffic delay and traffic queues for all approaches. For arterials, the segment analysis, the city uses our current roadway capacity tables to determine arterial level of service. Then for the pedestrian, bicycle, transit, non-vehicle modes, we of course are using the multimodal level of service methodology, and that is currently in development, and we're looking to update the multimodal level of service with the T&MC ad hoc committee. So that's essentially the analysis. So now we are looking at what the city, how the TIA guidelines address project impacts. So there are 2 types of project impacts. The first are called direct impacts. So these are significant impacts identified under the existing condition scenario. So these are things that the project is directly responsible for mitigating. So essentially it's just that existing plus project conditions, the impacts that are identified out of that scenario are these direct impacts. Then moving on from that, then we have the cumulative impacts. So these are significant impacts identified under the cumulative or the horizon year conditions. So the project has a role in these impacts and would be required to pay a fair share contribution to either the capital improvement program or the city's traffic impact fee to mitigate those impacts. So determination of vehicle impacts, or how are impacts determined? A project is determined to have a significant impact if one or more of these criteria is met. The first being that a facility, a segment exceeds level of service D, and the project meets or exceeds the threshold of significance. So if I could, I'll just point to that threshold of significance for roadway segments, meaning that if a project adds any trip to a segment forecast or operate at an efficient level of service requires project mitigation. Project mitigation will then be determined based upon project contribution to the identified impact. Just continuing on determination of vehicle impacts, additional ways that that's determined is the addition of project traffic results in change in level of service from an acceptable level of service D or better to a deficient level of service E or F. For locations that are currently operating at a deficient level of service without the project, those thresholds of significance apply. That goes back to table 6, which we just covered in the last slide. Then for determination of bicycle, pedestrian, and transit impacts, a project is determined to have a significant impact for these modes if an existing pedestrian, bicycle, or transit facility does not meet the level of service D standard, and if the project causes a standard facility to become substandard. For example, if a project were to remove bike lanes or remove a trail, that would be a significant impact. Or if a gap is identified directly adjacent to the study area, that would be a significant impact for those modes. For mitigation of bicycle and pedestrian and transit impacts, that is required to construct or contribute a fair share towards the financing of a feasible capital improvement project related to bicycle, pedestrian, and transit facilities. So that is the general overview of the traffic impact analysis guidelines. I do also want to mention that the city currently is doing vehicles mile traveled analysis. And this is based upon our VMT analysis guidelines that were adopted by City Council on June 16th of 2020. This is in response to, of course, SB 743 and CEQA, where it requires use of methods other than level of service to define impacts. Really, again, it's intended to shift the focus from measuring the impacts of drivers to measuring the impact of driving. So looking at it more of a big holistic picture. Today, the VMT analysis is conducted separately from traffic impact analysis. So essentially they have two different documents, and there is a bit of overlap between the two. So that may be something that the Traffic and Mobility Commission may wish to address in your comments. So the next steps for the update of the TIA guidelines. So after receiving input from the Traffic and Mobility Commission, staff will use your feedback to initiate the process to update the guidelines, and then staff will return to the commission with those proposed updates. So again, the recommended action is to obtain your feedback on the updates to the Transportation Impact Analysis guidelines. And I encourage open feedback. At this time, staff does not have any specific recommendations to update the guidelines. So we're really, even before we get into that, we thought it would be best to bring this before the Traffic and Mobility Commission to get your initial feedback. So then we can know, your thoughts, and we can take those and develop a game plan and an action plan to update the guidelines. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Nathan. Okay, commissioner comments. I see one. Going once, going twice. Okay, we're gonna start with Commissioner Linke. Because then I'm sure we're all gonna have comments and say, yes, whatever Commissioner Linke said, we approve.
I'll wait till I speak before you say that, but.
Okay.
So I obviously submitted a very large group of recommendations on changes I think need to be made. I have been, just to remind everybody, for the past year and a half, I've been monitoring planning department applications that go in front of this planning commission and the city council. So pretty much every development application that's come out in the past year and a half I've gone through, and the larger ones that I feel have mobility impacts, I've submitted substantial, similar to the thing I submitted for today, recommendations on various projects that probably should be done to mitigate the transportation impacts. And first, I want to thank Transportation Director Frank and Mr. Schmidt and Deputy City Manager Gomez for following through and bringing this item to us. It's extremely important. I'm also happy to say that at the City Council goal setting session, Mr. Franks, and I'm sorry he's not here, but Mr. Frank gave a presentation and emphasized the importance of updating the TIA guidelines and the TIF program and the TDM program, and his dedication doing that. So I really greatly appreciate that, but I do have some rather tough questions to ask. And I don't think I'm going to have time to cover all of the aspects, and I don't know whether we could entertain, again, having yet another ad hoc committee or something, because I don't want to spend hours here going over everything, but I'm willing to do that and, if people want to. But the first area that I'm concerned about is more a process question. And so back in March of 2017, the city signed a legal settlement agreeing to update the TIA guidelines within a year. And then about a year later, we have the document effectively that we have here. But in many of my comments that I've submitted for development projects, I've challenged, well, why aren't you following this rule? Why aren't you following that rule in the TIA guidelines? This is supposed to be the rules we're following. And the response I get from the community development department is that, well, we don't have to follow those rules. They were never publicly reviewed, so we don't have to follow them. And so I guess my question is, what was the approval process for the current TIA guidelines that somehow gave the community development department the authority to sort of, with impunity, ignore these rules? And what can we learn from that, so going forward that they're actually gonna be willing, and we need to change the culture there. We need to follow the rules. We want to work on the public's behalf. So I guess that's a question for staff, is what was this approval process? Who gave them the authority to not follow these rules, and how can we avoid that?
Yeah, I can do my best to speak to that. I mean, the guidelines were developed, of course, before my time here. But I think, staff definitely hears your concerns, Commissioner Linke. I think we do want to take a very critical look at updating our guidelines and the processes behind those. So again, I think all comments are on the table at this point. If you do want to focus on process, those types of issues, now is a great time to bring it up. Because behind the scenes we'll be working on a plan beyond just the guidelines, and we'll also be looking at the process itself. So the staff here is definitely willing to work with you and try to address those concerns head on the best we can.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think there just needs to be like a complete cultural change to, we want to follow these rules. These rules are set in place in the best interest of the public. And then just one other process question is that one of the first things that Mr. Schmidt described was the scoping requirements. So the TIA guidelines at the very beginning talk about how there's a requirement that a scoping agreement be executed with the developer upfront before they even start the whole process of doing a TIA. And that defines all those aspects that he then went on to discuss, the trip generation rates, trip reductions, where the traffic is going, what methods are used, what is necessary. And I think most other jurisdictions have a similar requirement that a scoping agreement be executed in writing, so that it's clear to the developer and the city and the public that this is what's supposed to happen. And then if there are major changes along the way, of course, that can happen and does, then you have a written amendment to that scoping agreement. Now, I've submitted comments for probably 8 or 10 different development applications over the course of this last year and a half, including major ones that have extremely complex TIAs, ones that include combinations of MMLOS and VMT, ones that have switched midstream from LOS to VMT. Not one of those applications has the scoping agreement been executed, and the rest of the TIA guidelines refers back to the scoping agreement constantly. So that one of the main things of the TIA guidelines is how the scoping agreement is managed. And the response I get from staff, from the community development staff, is that, well, we don't choose to do the scoping agreement, even though it says you shall do it. We don't feel we have to do it. We think we can do it by a series of emails over years of time, or we can just do it on the phone. In some of these instances, I've asked for public records to document what was the scoping process, and they say, well, we did the entire thing over a series of phone calls over several months. So it's all being, I get the perception that it's all being done in secret. So similar to my question about how are we going to make sure they follow the rules? How are we going to make sure that they know that they need to do scoping agreements when they feel like they don't have to?
May I?
Yes, Ms. Gomez.
So I just wanted to address a couple of your comments, Commissioner Linke, and And certainly there is not a representative from the Community Development Department in attendance with us at the moment. And so, so just wanted to share that we have been in conversation with them on perhaps how do we address these in the future, right? And looking internally with regards to who does what, and does it make sense to transition from perhaps one department to another, or setting things into place so that we do have the transparency that you're looking for. I think there was a transition period with regards to some projects that were already in the application process and what have you, with regards to when it was that the scoping agreement was put into place, and certainly the scrutiny that maybe some of the projects received in the past. So this is, because we don't have all the information and the background and staff here to discuss it, what I would suggest, if I may, is for us to take that information that you have put and that you have put into writing, look into how we can improve the transparency, put in the appropriate words for the guidelines that are there to make sure that they're enforceable, and also for staff to be accountable to be able to present it. And one of the things, at least, that since I've been here, I, like Nathan, Mr. Schmidt, was also not here during the initial guidelines development. But since I have been here, our city manager has been very forthcoming in being transparent, and certainly presenting things to be adopted by City Council. And so just like the Sustainable Mobility Plan that was just adopted. So our intent is to really take a look at the guidelines, come up with ways to improve the process, increase accountability, transparency, however it is that that we can improve the process, and have it be vetted in a public forum, such as first the Traffic and Mobility Commission, allow everyone to take a look at what is being proposed once we've developed them, or to improve them, and then present them to City Council, so that you had mentioned that staff had said, well, this was not really fully adopted. Well, that is not our intent. To move it forward so that we make the recommendations and we present it in a forum. We are here now soliciting feedback from the commission in a very public forum. And so we'll be moving forward, taking everyone's input into consideration. So that is our intent. And so we'd like to focus in how we can move forward and improve, maybe improve the scoping agreements, and or if there are language in there that we need to address, because there are some applications and some projects that are already in transition. Do they apply to them? Are there projects that are grandfathered? Those are items that I think we need to address, so that it's clear to everyone across the board that this process or these new guidelines will be effective whatever date certain. And if there's any grandfathering, then there will be grandfathering, or not, as the case may be.
Okay, I appreciate.
I have
those.
a question to help me understand. Process when there's a developer comes to the plan, and then from staff there's a large, let's say you have a large development that does impact the traffic significantly. Who from staff departments, who reviews it and gives the okay from the traffic and mobility side?
So Chair, I missed the first part of your question, but I think you're generally asking about who oversees the process now.
Who, when there is a major project, a developer coming in with a major project that impacts significantly the traffic, what is the review process from the city? Is Traffic and Mobility Department or Transportation Department reviewing and giving their okay, or is it just planning and whatever else departments?
So, I'll answer that question. Currently, the previous projects, all of the ones that Commissioner Linke was addressing, is that these projects go into our community development department, and so there is a team of traffic engineers and consultants that take a look at what is being submitted and prepared. So the lead for those projects is our community development department presently. That's what I was alluding to in that taking a look at how maybe we can improve the process with regards to perhaps the transportation department taking the lead on these types of items. So those are things that we are in the process of discussing. And that's why I, not stating the affirmative that this is the way that it is. We are in the process of taking a look at what makes the most sense with regards to these types of reviews.
Okay. And how do we make sure that we do make these plans and they're actually implemented, not just we just make the plans and they can say, or whoever can say, we don't have to follow this?
Oh, no. So two different things that our discussions internally within staff between the different departments and what have you is really the process of how we are going to do these reviews and moving forward. The guidelines that we're talking about, the TIA guidelines that currently exist from 2018, we are soliciting the Commission's feedback and input to improve that process. So when we get the recommendations on the actual TIA guidelines 2.0 or the revision, we will be presenting it here to the Traffic and Mobility Commission for your support, just like we usually do for other things before presenting to City Council. So we're in the early part of the development. So as Mr. Schmidt mentioned earlier, we don't have, staff does not have a recommendation at this.
I don't know who has background, maybe me. I just want to make sure I understand what we're doing right now. I just want to make sure that we are creating this 2.0 strong enough that does not allow, because I can totally feel the frustration, Commissioner Linke's, and I am frustrated to hear, and I even had residents telling me, I was part of that meeting and there's this big development that did not have enough parking and they did not have to follow the rules, and why? And somehow, because I'm connected with the city as on the commission, people expect me to know why about every project that has parking and traffic, and and it's very hard for me to not, my first instinct is to defend the city, to say there's got to be a good reason, but it feels like it happens so often that public is kind of lost trust that there is a good reason. So I know that we are gaining public's trust and we're doing a really good job slowly, and that's why the transportation department has been so great working with us. But I just want to make sure that we're creating these plans that have to be followed, and they will be by whoever, if whatever department it is, right? It's not just that the transportation department has to be kind of the police over, make sure that you're following.
That's correct. And so, and that's what I was alluding to with regards to who does what, right? The responsibilities. And just to give an example, for things that are submitted for these developments and projects and what have you that are utilities related, water, recycled water, wastewater, it's very, very clear that even though it does come into the land development engineering division for the plan check, et cetera, that portion of the utilities is sent to the utilities department and the Carlsbad Municipal Water District. and the reviews and the checks are done at that department and then provided back to land development engineering within the community development department for the final reviews and other items. So that's very clear. So that is something that we are looking at what makes sense internally for us, that perhaps for things that are traffic related, that should be under the purview of the transportation department. So that's what I was alluding to. That is, we're still in the process, which is why we're having those discussions. That's a separate internal staff process that we are looking at, separate from these TIA guidelines. So to answer your question with regards to that, we acknowledge that there are some folks, including Commissioner Linke, yourself, perhaps others, that are concerned with that. And so we want to take a look at that. We are building the relationship with the Transportation Department and the Commission. And so we are looking at how best to approach that so that we're holding ourselves accountable and also others within the staff to make sure that if there are answers that needed to be provided, that we can have the appropriate response to any of the public's questions.
I think that's
Thank you.
I don't know if it's the echo from me again. I do trust and I trust staff that we have all best interest at heart going forward. So anything that we can do to support it. So now Commissioner Linke.
Okay, can I resume?
I'm wondering, I'm wondering if, like you mentioned, if the other commissioners feel that we should have an ad hoc, and I don't know how staff feel about that. If you feel like it's long enough that we should take it aside, or if it's something that we can just have this meeting and then staff will be able to come back with their recommendation. And what's the Commissioner Linke first, and then I'll let Nathan give feedback on the comment.
Yeah, so I have a few more comments I'd like to make after Mr. Schmidt speaks, just to sort of summarize some of the issues that I raised in my suggestions. And if staff would prefer that I go over them now, I'm happy to do that or do it offline. To follow up on something that you just suggested, Chair Gokin, I think the way we ensure that the guidelines are followed is probably what we're doing. Is this is going to serve as a public review, and then having the City Council adopt the document, which did not happen back in 2018. It was created, the current TIA guidelines were created. I honestly think there should be some sort of internal investigation of how such an important document could be created in response to a legal settlement, but then with impunity just not followed because it was never approved. And then I have been calling for its public review for 2 years. And meanwhile, I'm submitting letters saying you need to follow the rules, and they say, well, no, we don't have to because it's never been publicly reviewed. While I'm simultaneously at our commission meeting saying we should review them. And I'm going to just be rather blunt and say, I think that what happened here is that the Community Development Department took over the entirety of the traffic stuff at some point in the past. And their sort of reward system or goal is to get developments through with as little problem as possible. So even if there was a fair share that they should have made for mobility projects, it was the Community Development Department was happy to creatively interpret the rules in ways that minimize the impact. And I want to cover a little bit of that, but I'm interested in hearing from staff if they would go along with an ad hoc committee or working outside so that we don't take hours here.
Nathan?
Yes, yeah. No, I think we've seen that ad hoc committees, they work very well, specifically on projects like this that do require this deeper dive and this deeper level of commitment. So I would be totally on board with setting up an ad hoc committee. I think it's worked well for the SMP, the multimodal level of service, and this would be a very similar exercise where we really need to get and look at those nitty-gritty details behind the guidelines. So I think it would work well, and it's a good suggestion.
Okay.
Okay, and if you'll indulge me, go ahead. Oh, I think,
I was just wanted to see all the volunteers, everybody raising their hands that they want to be in it. Commissioner. I got Commissioner Linky. Anybody else interested?
I think the vice chair wants to be on it.
Okay, we'll ask him. I would like to be on it. I mean, it's transportation, so to me that's always a very, very warm subject I like to read about at night when I go to bed. No, I'm just joking. I'm studying for my PE exam again in transportation engineering. So yeah, it's something that I read every day for hours.
There you go.
I know, right? Okay, so do we have to make a motion for this to create an ad hoc committee?
Yes, yes, you would.
Yes. Commissioner Linky, would you
Ad
like
hoc.
to make that motion? And it will be, how many, is there a minimum or a max? I know maximum, it can be more than majority, right?
Yeah, it's 3. I think that's,
3.
yeah, it just has to be 3.
Three or less, but
Okay, you can't have a majority.
Yeah.
That would be like a Brown Act issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't feel comfortable volunteering a vice chair because he's already pretty busy with everything else. So if it's fine with just Commissioner Linky and myself, I think that would be good for now. And I guess if we need more help, we can. Okay, so Commissioner Linky, would you like to make a motion?
yeah, I'll make a motion to create an ad hoc committee to work with staff on the transportation impact analysis guideline update. But I would like to make a few additional comments
Okay.
after or after the second or after the vote, if possible.
Okay, yeah, we can do that. Do I have a second for the ad hoc?
a second.
Okay, let's vote. Commissioner Linky made the motion with Commissioner Hunter seconding to create an ad hoc for this item.
Commissioner Linky,
Aye.
Commissioner Wanamaker is absent. Commissioner Fowler,
Aye.
Commissioner Pensiers,
Yes.
Commissioner Hunter.
Aye.
Vice Chair Perez is absent. Chair Goken.
Yes. Please note it passed 5-2 with 2 commissioners being absent. Okay, please, Commissioner Linky, continue your comments.
Thank you. I just wanted to provide a couple examples. So these are real world examples of what's currently happening, and it will continue to happen until we make the revisions. So the sooner this gets done, the better, because as Ms. Gomez mentioned, the ones that I had reviewed, they were in the system a year or more ago. And in that time, more are in the queue now, more are in the pipeline, and every day there could be more, and we need to apply correct rules. So, and this, again, these are real world examples related to the areas that Mr. Schmidt introduced. And so one of the most important aspects of a transportation impact analysis is one of the very first steps, and that's estimating how many net new average daily vehicle trips, or ADT, are expected to be generated by the project. And if the project is a so-called mixed use project, for example, where there's a grocery store or other stores mixed in with the residences, then obviously there's less trips that are necessary to go outside. So you get to take a reduction of your average daily trips if it's a mixed use development. And Sandag, in their not so brief guide, as Mr. Schmidt referred to, allows, and it says up to a 10% credit or reduction with justification. All right, so one of these developments, a relatively large one, had like a small restaurant and a bike shop planned for their development. So they said, okay, it's mixed use, so we can take a 10% credit. But they took the full 10% credit, even though they have a little, these little tiny shops, and they provided no justification. And so they probably were, this probably was worth maybe a 2%, but they took a 10%, and you can take hundreds of ADTs off by saying, in theory, you could build a 10,000 home huge development and put a little coffee kiosk on the corner and say, okay, it's mixed use because I've got this little coffee stand at the corner of this 10,000 unit complex. You can't reduce the number of trips from that by 1,000 or 10% just because there's a little coffee stand. All right, so that's one example. Another example is another reduction can be used if the project is replacing current businesses. So the same development that I just talked about is demolishing a few little businesses that are currently there. And they had done driveway counts at those businesses to determine how much existing traffic is there, because you can subtract that out because those businesses are going away. They took the traffic counts, 700 average daily trips was the conclusion. All right, but then staff, right before the staff report was developed, or even after the staff report was developed, said, we're going to switch from that method where we're counting actual cars, and we're going to switch to an estimation method. And they come up with like 2,400 vehicles instead of 700. So you can subtract 1,500 more vehicles than you did with the method that uses the actual data by using this estimator method. In that case, through public records requests, I found emails from the developer who was saying, we don't think that's right. These businesses are underperforming. They're not, the numbers are not right. And even so, staff allowed them, or maybe even forced them, to reduce. So their average daily trips were reduced by like 1,500 just by switching the reduction method. So this is a pattern that I've seen. I'm a scientist and we're supposed to let the data speak. And what I've observed with traffic engineering is that if you're somebody who wants a low number, the consultant will do whatever they can, cherry pick whichever methods make it look the lowest. Or if you're on the other side, maybe you want it to be a high number, so that you want to force them to do mitigation, you can choose different methods. And they say both are right. So it was right that it was 3,000 average daily trips, and it's right that it's 1,000. It's just a matter of which method you use. So these, in the city of San Diego, as an example, I put some language in my in my letter saying, citing what San Diego does, and they require that you do driveway counts when it's a redevelopment project. So that's an example of one of the changes that we can make is, if it's a redevelopment project, you need to use driveway counts, not crazy estimator methods, and not allow this sort of shenanigans to occur. Okay, last example is with the VMT analysis. And so one of the credits you can take is if you've got a thing called unbundled parking. So one development, which is still in process, they're using unbundled parking to mitigate their traffic. And what the theory there is that if you charge like $100 extra per month per parking spot in an apartment complex, separated from the rent, that people are going to be less likely to buy a car, use a car, because they have to pay extra. But you have to provide alternatives for them to driving. And so I suggested that there are bus stops, but you have to cross Palomar Airport Road. Could you please put some high visibility crosswalks in there so that the people that are coming from this development feel safe getting over to the bus stop, because you're using the bus stop as your alternative to driving and not having a space. Not even willing to entertain putting in high visibility crosswalks across Palomar Airport Road. Not one suggestion that I have made in hundreds of pages of my recommendations, all of which, of course, I think are reasonable, have been accepted. Now, to take that a step further, and I'll finish on this, the other alternative they have to parking, in the unbundled parking, is a car share program and a network electric vehicle program. And there's a guide called the CAPCOA guide, which gives percentages of reduction that you can take. So if the VMT is too high for the project, and let's say they have to reduce it by 14%, then the CAPCOA guide says, well, you can take an X% reduction if you have a car share program. You can take another % reduction if you have a network electric vehicle program. Well, in this case, this particular development, they decided that it was okay to, there's 200 apartments, they're going to buy one car and put it in the development and say that is our car share program. So these 200 apartments get this one car, and then they get like a 5% VMT reduction credit for having this one car as a car share program. But if you look in the CAPCOA guide, their definition of a car share program is more like a citywide fleet of vehicles, not just a single car for a single development. This car share programs don't scale down like that to a single development. And then as far as the network electric vehicle program, network electric vehicles are like golf carts with multiple passengers and storage, excuse me, and a dedicated street network. That's the definition of the CAPCOA guide. So all of these components. And instead, the developer said, we're going to buy 8 e-bikes and scatter them around this development. And that constitutes a network electric vehicle program that's comparable to what's in the CAPCOA guide. So there's all kinds of these shenanigans, and I've tried to call them out on it and say, this is not sufficient. I'm not asking to not have development. I'm not against any of these developments. I think they're great. They provide affordable housing. They provide need housing, some of it close to offices. But the city, with our SMP, is planning on 1 project per year. And we've got guidance that I disagree with, and that's a topic for another day, that the city isn't required to maintain MMLOS D for our pedestrian and transit. So the opportunity here is to, let's follow the growth management plan, let's follow the general plan, and have developers pay just their fair share, not a cent more, but not a cent less. But the community development department seems determined to let them just skate by with nothing. And so I'll end on that and say, you know, I think there needs to be a cultural shift, and maybe it takes some direction from the city council as well, not just me. But I look forward to working on an ad hoc committee, and I hope we can implement some of these changes. And there'll be some maybe that staff will agree with. There might be some that they disagree with, and then I will go into more detail on those at a later date, why I think that they're wrong. But I'll end there. Thank you.
Good. I'm sure that a lot of us agree with you. So we just need patience and hard work between all of us, staff and us, and we'll get there sooner or later. Okay, so with that, do we still have to vote on anything on this item?
Nope, that's it. It was just to obtain feedback, and you've already voted. So.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so now let me go back to my agenda. Then we have city traffic engineer, Commissioner Pensier, you have a comment? Commissioner Pensier, you wanted to say something? You are unmuted.
Okay. In that document, there was a discussion of roundabouts and the methods that were used. There's a couple of acronyms, RIDEL or something like that. And I wonder if we could have some training on that and maybe have a better understanding of why the city seems to prefer traffic lights to roundabouts, even on roads that are single lane. You know, or could be single lane, such as Poinsettia. There's not nearly enough traffic on that road to justify a 4-lane road, and yet there we have it. And we also have a lower level of service with the traffic lights than we would have had with single lane roundabouts, and that just doesn't make any sense to me. So I'd like to understand a little bit more on why we do that. Because once you put in the traffic lights, and, you know, we did this on a road where we had a fresh pallet. It would have been very easy to install the roundabouts at that point. Once you install the traffic lights and spend almost $1 million in gas tax money, there's no way you're gonna rip those things back out and put in roundabouts. So how do we get ahead of the game? And how do we install them where it makes sense? And maybe I just don't understand that these methods that are used to calculate the, you know, the throughput on a roundabout. I know that, you know, for example, the Highway Design Manual penalizes roundabouts and stop signs as far as the level level of service for the time delay. You know, you can have a level of service D for a traffic light that is a level of service F for the same amount of time, actually 5 seconds less, for a roundabout, which doesn't make any sense to me, but that's the way it's set up.
So
I wonder,
things here, you almost sound like you want to be part of the ad hoc.
yes, okay.
Yes, we're going to have the ad hoc committee, and then we're going to have all these discussions there, and I'm sure staff will be able to answer all our questions, and then we'll go from there. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so any other comments on that last item?